Hi, how are
Hi,
you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. I rearranged my situation. All right, there's my camera. So I'm gonna put you where my camera is and turn this way. Hi.
Excellent. How was Australia?
It was a whirlwind. We
Yeah,
basically did 4 shows in 5 days, so we were flying on show day every day, and not really enough time to get accustomed to the time zones and everything. But the audiences were great, the shows were great, and it was the end of this year's Devin Townsend touring cycle. So
the-
it was such a good band. So it was, you
that's
know,
great.
emotionally complex because it's the end of this particular run and it was so good, but
Yeah.
it was also so good. So
Let's talk a little bit about you, Mike.
all right.
You've had an illustrious career. You've worked with Frank Zappa, Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, Andy Partridge. You have an impressive discography as a solo artist. And apart from creating wonderful music, the thing I like about what you do is that you seem to be just as happy playing a couple of chords on the acoustic guitar as you are playing many on the electric. Um, there's this open approach to your music making, which has a great sense of freedom and maturity. And it's something that I find very appealing. So I wanted to start by asking you about your musical development during the formative years, in particular, your interest in Frank Zappa's music. Could we start
Okay,
with that?
certainly. Well, I had already been interested in music for a number of years by the time I encountered Frank's music. So my my first passion was the Beatles, which started when I was around 6, and then I heard Frank when I was 9.
Mhm.
And I think when I heard Frank for the first time, because I was already getting a lot of nutrition from Beatle music for a variety of reasons, but it was when I heard Frank that I realized that there was something that I was missing, which was this. What initially grabbed me was just kind of the humor of it and the absurdist streak.
Yeah.
Uh, like because the first song that I heard was "Help I'm a Rock," and at age 9, I wasn't necessarily equipped to understand the sort of the social commentary aspects of it. It was, to me, it was all just absurdity
Yeah.
when he was talking about being a rock and suddenly swerving into I remember they had a swimming pool as a a totem for suburban conformity. I was just thinking of it as, what the hell, where did that come from? So it was the adventurousness, the unexpectedness, and the humor aspect that really grabbed me at first. And then as I got more and more passionate about finding out more and collecting more records, and then I realized that there was such a vast stylistic diversity, and that really grabbed me.
Yeah.
And then because the order in which I collected the records was unusual. It went from Freak Out to Fillmore East to We're Only in It for the Money. So that's really kind of three very distinct sorts of Frank. And when I heard "We're Only in It for the Money," that's when sort of the social commentary aspect started to come clear, and also the studio mastery aspect. And I got very excited about the all the unusual sounds, the experimentation, and also the structure of it, the formal structure of it, the fact that one side of a record was one continuous piece of music. That
Mhm.
was very exciting for me, and the fact that you never knew what was coming around the corner on that record. There was stylistic twists and turns on a dime,
Yeah.
and all that stuff was just food for my soul at that point.
Yeah.
And then just continuing to collect, and oh my gosh, Uncle Meat, what's this? That was really sort of the beginning of my starting to get a grasp of what some of Frank's interests compositionally.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just making statements, he wasn't just trying to shock. he was also a very serious composer, and I encountered that music at the same time that I was obsessed with Keith Emerson, because my first instrument was organ, and my first Emerson Lake and Palmer album was Tarkus. So that extended piece of music, Tarkus, at age 8, I think, was a huge thing for me. So when I started hearing stuff like Uncle Meat, Waka Jawaka, other more compositionally oriented things, that slotted right into my burgeoning interest in progressive rock, and I was interested in the fact that Frank had aspects in common with some of this other prog music. We didn't call it that at the time, but so clearly stood apart from it, because he would also happily spend 9 minutes playing a guitar solo over one chord, whereas most prog bands wouldn't do that. So, I over time, I just started, building a picture in my head of what is this Zappa guy about, and I was just fascinated, obsessed, actually. And at a certain point, he just became the top of the totem pole for me in terms of musicians that I was obsessed with.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite an early age you were introduced to his music. I didn't get to it until 15, 16, but 8, 9 must have been quite an experience listening to that at such a tender age,
It was forced upon me by the neighbor kid across the street who said, his exact words were, "You're weird, you should listen to this," and he brought me over to listen to Help on a Rock, and then I instantly needed to acquire that album, and I traded him something for it. I can't remember what, but some, like, probably 2 albums from my collection, since it was a double album, and then Freak Out was mine. This is the early 70s is when I became interested, 71, 72, and he was very prolific at that point. So it seemed like every time I went to the record store, there was a new album. And so at a certain point, basically overnight, apostrophe Roxy, I was acquiring those albums as they were new. And so at that point I was like fully into the journey.
Yeah.
And I remember, especially when Roxy came out and I heard the suite on side 2, because at that age where you're forming your sort of musical cosmogony, or whatever you want to call it, what makes up your approach to life via music, and I think I was a little bit snobbish. So when Overnight and Apostrophe came out, I was like, what's with all these short, conventional tunes? And then when Roxy came out with that unbelievable suite on side 2, that just blew my head open, and I think I decided at that moment, this is the ideal Zappa music. And to this day, when anybody says something like Zappa-esque, my head goes to the Roxy band, that era, for his writing and his orchestrating, and the instrumentation that he had in the group at that time. It's just, it's if you got a band with George Duke and Bruce Fowler and Ruth Underwood, not to mention Tom Fowler on bass, and both Chester Thompson and Ralph Humphrey on drums, it's like you've got it all covered, really. It's like there's nothing you can't do.
No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. When did you start picking things from records? I'm assuming that you learned a lot of the music from listening to records. When did you start, and what were the first sort of tracks that you started to pick out on the guitar?
I think, if I remember correctly, I really got into seriously beginning to learn the stuff. It wasn't it almost felt as though it was not available to me, like it was too far beyond my abilities. But I was intrigued by the fact that in the booklet to Uncle Meat, there were a couple of small manuscript excerpts of King Kong and Uncle Meat. And I remember reading along with Uncle Meat and saying, okay, this is beyond my ability to grasp right now, but King Kong, I think I can just about figure out. So I think King Kong, with the help of that little tiny scrap of manuscript in the booklet, was the first thing that I tried to figure out. But that was, obviously, I did have that piece of music, so it wasn't fully just trying to decode stuff by ear. it was a few years later that I really got seriously into trying to figure out the songs from the albums. But interestingly enough, I came to that via other bands. Like I spent one summer when I was 16 learning every Gentle Giant guitar part that had been released at that point. And then that same summer I learned A Passion Play by Jethro Tull, because that album was really fascinating to me. And then it was, a couple of years after that I think I decided, okay, I'm gonna, just like roll up my sleeves and start getting into this Zappa music. And I think I started by trying to learn the Black Page. I said I might as well start with the most impossible thing, and then spent a certain amount of time trying to decode that. And I got fascinated by, okay, let's just try to figure out how to get performable versions of songs that seem completely abstract. Things that no sane person would try to work out a solo performing rendition of. And that's when I figured out a way to play I don't know how to pronounce it, but Zolar Sackle from Uncle Meat, which is just this 45-minute total bit of atonal insanity, but it's very, very specifically notated, obviously. So I figured out a solo keyboard arrangement of that. And then I was learning Black Page on both guitar and keys. And I also had the Frank Zappa Songbook, Volume 1, which was a really good book that had solo piano arrangements of an unreleased version of Little House I Used to Live In. Mm-hmm. At that point, it was unreleased. That became the basis of the later, like 78, 79 arrangement. Mm-hmm. And the revised music piano intro, which is really beautiful. Yeah. So I was, at that point, I was learning it mostly on keyboards because I considered myself a keyboardist primarily. I was having organ lessons as a kid. So I was, to the extent that I was trained formally, it was on keyboard. And I never had a guitar lesson. So, at a certain point when I started teaching myself stuff like Sinister Footwear and, I just got, very excited as my guitar skills started developing, that I was, able to consider learning this stuff. And then, I heard Sinister Footwear for the first time on the Halloween '81 show, which I recorded live off the radio. I didn't have MTV, so I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. It was broadcast on a local station. And Sinister Footwear hadn't been released yet, so I didn't know what that thing was called. On my cassette, I referred to it as Wild Love Deluxe because it had that one passage from Wild Love in there. And I loved the melody of that so much that was one of the first things I really tried to teach myself. But on the guitar anyway. But the real catalyzing moment when I heard that Halloween show was hearing Steve playing the middle section of Montana, the I'm Plucking the Old Dental Floss melody on the guitar. Mm-hmm. That was an eye opener, a mind opener, because I didn't think you could play melodies like that on the guitar. It was just a total. The whole scene was reset at that point for me. Yeah, it was
no mean feat. The accomplishments he made back in his days with Zappa, just astonishing guitar technique and navigation of things that are not really written for the guitar. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the Sinister Footwear too. I mean, for years I just thought it was the most amazing piece of music I had ever heard. That little interlude there, just absolutely brilliant. Even now, I just like, how do you go about composing something like that?
Before I really was able to spend time studying the manuscripts of that stuff to see how they really go. I suddenly found myself in the band, and I really managed to weasel my way into that group based on the degree to which I developed my ear from learning stuff off of the records. Mm-hmm. And I had managed to do a good enough job of that for Frank to evidently say, okay, this is a resource that I can make use of. I will take you on. But once I actually got in the band and started executing this stuff alongside the other members of the band who really knew how the music went, who actually understood the mathematics of the Black Page melody and all this other stuff, whereas I was just like, all right, you start at point A, you play this many notes, and you end at point B, and not really understanding the math of how precisely all those notes are placed. I was kind of going on feel, in other words. So to suddenly be contending with the fact that no, this isn't just a bunch of notes that starts here and ends there. This is a quintuplet, and a quintuplet means this. I hadn't even gotten that specific, that theoretical in the way I was approaching the music. So in some ways it's absurd that I managed to get into Frank's band without even that much, but what it meant was I had to figure it out really, really fast. I hadn't even formed a mental image of how this stuff would look on paper, other than the fact that I was sure it would be dense. And also, by the time I had gotten into the band, I had gotten the Zappa guitar book with all of Vai's transcriptions of all the guitar solos, which, within those transcriptions is every imaginable mathematical formula in terms of how to fit this many notes into this amount of space. And I did read along with all those solos. I didn't attempt to play them, but it was instructive for me just to see what, this thing that I knew what it sounded like from the records, to see it decoded that way. Yeah. So by the time I started seeing, manuscripts of the stuff, once I got into the band, it wasn't surprising, but it was highly educational, and it was a great relief to finally feel like I wasn't just suspended in space trying to understand this music. Now there was science to support it all, and I could actually, even though I was not trained in this way, I was not trained to be a reader, and my sight reading is still not anything, but to have these visual counterpoints to the music that were there, they were there for me to refer to at any point that I needed to, and they would be there for the rest of my life. So they were extremely helpful to me in that regard. Yeah. But I'm still not somebody who I still think ear first when it comes to music, as opposed to eyes, and that's still the way I process and learn music, is just by listening carefully.
Nothing wrong with that.
But because I have spent time reading this stuff, I have at least a bit of theoretical knowledge to back up what I'm hearing. It's not all just these abstruse points in space wobbling around.
You're playing on those 2 live albums is absolutely phenomenal. So
thank you. Thank you.
Just wonderful. And
it's difficult for me to accept that compliment, because I was so young, and when I go back and listen now, all I can hear is what I wish I could have been doing if I'd known more, but I do appreciate that.
No, it was intriguing to hear parts played on the guitar that weren't played on recordings, the original recordings in Alien Orifice, for example, that sort of middle section there. And I heard you play it first on that live album back in 91, 92, when I got the album. I was like, wow, that's so cool, because obviously in the original recordings it's just tuned percussion and keys, but
right. I could not believe how loud Frank put that in the mix at that part of the song. I was like, whoa.
And you can be heard. It's nice. It's very nice.
Yeah, and I also hear, towards the end, me just like racing to catch up. It's like there's so many notes that it's just so relentless that it's just like somebody pushing you down a ski hill.
Were there any sort of techniques that you learned when you were playing this stuff? Did you have any sort of ways, because I've spoken to Steve Vai about this and how to navigate these guitar parts. What kind of challenges did you have when you were learning these parts?
The main challenge was always just to come up with any sort of executable version of a phrase. And because I was still so fresh and untested as a guitar player, again, because I'd never had anybody tell me what I should be doing on the guitar as opposed to what I was doing, when I initially learned a lot of these things, I learned them in ways that were not necessarily the way that emphasized the most comfortable phrasing for me. It was just a way that I was able to execute, and once I was able to find any way to execute, I'd say, okay, check, and move on to the next phrase. And in some cases that meant that I was just building up a catalog of phrases that were not practical. So to this day, even when I go back and like I just did 3 nights at the Baked Potato with Joe Travers' One Shot Deal Band, and so he sends me the repertoire, and it's largely a bunch of songs that I've played for decades, but maybe several of them I haven't played in decades. So I'm calling these songs back up from memory and remembering how I played them in my 20s, and going, man, that is, not only completely, asking my hand to do something that doesn't work for it, it doesn't even sound good because it might have, too many notes on the same fret on adjacent strings, which encourages, sloppiness, as opposed to, maybe going up a fourth on the same string. And it not only does it like encourage greater movement of all your fingers, get all your fingers into the game, it makes the melody sing more because you're able to be more expressive the more fingers you are able to use on one string, as opposed to constantly switching strings all the time. So I'm able to get a more, a sonically pleasing interpretation of the melody that way. And that has become my focus anytime I'm asked to play Zappa, or at this point anything, is try to figure out ways to interpret the notes, because that's the thing that stringed instruments have that other instruments don't necessarily have, especially keyboard instruments. I mean, on a piano, that note is only there, so it's whereas on a guitar, that note is there and there and there and there, and this opens up so many possibilities in terms of how you execute the thing. So, now after many decades of having played, I'm more focused on, not just what is needed to pull this off, as opposed, the job is to make the thing sing. And, how do I find the combination of frets and strings that work best with my hand to execute like the most flowing version of this melody, or if it's not flowing, if it needs to be more, staccato and pointillistic, what's the best way to do that? Finding the approaches that best serve the music, basically.
Sure. And I think in terms of the technical side of things, as Steve's mentioned and you're mentioning as well, it's just there is no methodology in approaching these guitar parts. It's just seems to me from what you guys are saying that it's just by any means necessary. You've got to navigate it to the best of your ability and get to the notes as expediently as possible.
It's that, but it's also an acknowledgement of every player is wired differently, so everybody's ideal interpretation of how to execute a part is going to be different for each player's set of characteristics. So for the version of a melody arrangement on the fretboard is the most eloquent for me, might not be the same for any other player, because there are certain things coming into play when I do it. The one being the fact that I'm entirely untrained, that all my ability to be eloquent, to the extent that it exists, has built out of just the version of guitar playing that I've built for myself. And so, as you say, there are no hard and fast rules over what's the best way to execute a melody, because I firmly believe that that's going to change for however any individual player is wired, and everybody's wired differently.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, I agree. And I was going to ask you as well about your experience with Steve Vai, because you worked with Steve Vai during the 90s. You did a few tours, and how was that? I mean, learning that kind of material. I mean, I was going to say, I saw a video of you guys playing the Attitude song, and it's just fantastic. I mean, you're just dancing around the stage, and everything's so precise. There's no mistakes. Everything's on, spot on, and it's really impressive. It's a wonderful moment. But yeah, I just was curious to know about the other material you were playing with Steve Vai at that time, and how.
Whereas a lot of Frank's music, the stuff that was most challenging about Frank's music was learning the melodies that were not necessarily ever meant to be played by guitar in the first place. All of Steve's music that I had to learn, or at least the stuff that I was playing on guitar, although the same the same certainly applied to the piano stuff that I had to do on the Fire Garden. Is that the guitar stuff is written very specifically for guitar, and not just that, is written very specifically for the way Steve Vai played guitar. So to an extent, I never had to do with Frank. I mean, to some extent, when you're learning Zappa music, you need to place yourself into the mind of the composer, and to some degree the producer, in order to decode what's going on in those records. But to learn Steve's music, you need to, place yourself into the mind and the soul and the fingers of the guitar player, Steve, because all those articulations, every little bend, every little, vibrato dip, when the reason why Attitude Song works is because we sat there knee to knee for hours, and he said, this is exactly how fast you go down on the vibrato bar. This is exactly how far you go on the vibrato bar. This is how long you stay there before you even consider bending back up. And this is the rate at which you bend back up. And all this stuff needs to
Science.
Yeah, it is. And it has to be either in unison, well, at all times in unison with Steve, although at times the pitches could be in harmony or an octave apart. But the motion of the thing, the articulation of the thing, is such a huge part of Steve's vision. His cosmological vision as a composer it goes way beyond just the notes. So my standard line has always been that playing with Steve Vai was the best guitar lessons I ever got paid to take, because there's no, I could never overstate how much I learned in such a brief period of time. And that was one of the few gigs where I remember feeling, I think I was either working on Erotic Nightmares or Greasy Kid stuff, and there was some guitar phrase in there that was just so far beyond anything that I had ever done, because I was playing the way I came up as a guitar player was so idiosyncratic and so geared to very specific kinds of music, and I was never trying to, where every other guitar player was trying to figure out what is Eddie Van Halen doing. I was fascinated by how Gary Green's guitar parts fit into the architecture of Gentle Giant music. I was more into that, the way things locked together compositionally and arrangement wise, and not so much in the tapping or the sweep picking or just being insanely fast on a guitar. I felt that in some ways that I was still a hobbyist guitar player even when I got the Vai gig. It's because I was trained as a keyboardist. I showed myself how to play guitar for a good time. I taught myself how to play Zappa music on guitar for a good time. And then all of a sudden I was in Zappa's band just because I made the right phone call at the right time, and I'm playing guitar. So I have to get very serious about this stuff that up until that moment was just a good time. And then I went from Frank's band to Dweezil's band, and Dweezil was a really interesting composer for guitar. And at that point, he was writing a lot of compositions that didn't even end up on records that were used as like segue material during a live show. And it was really, really intense music, and it was great, and it was really energetic and really fun. But again, it wasn't necessarily about figuring out how to play all the stuff Dweezil was doing as a lead player. But then when I got into Vai's band, it was having to understand what he was playing when he was doing the main guitar part in Attitude Song, or Answers, or any of these other songs. Every Steve Vai song really is a guitar lesson. He seems to want to push himself in some way with everything that he writes for guitar.
Sure.
So learning how to do that stuff was, I remember feeling at that early stage, this is too much, and I had never felt that before. Like, I might not be able to execute on this gig. I just might not be able to do it. And I think I just I got the gig like 3 days too late or something, because it was 3 days into the tour that I finally started feeling like, okay, I can play this. It's not that, like, the first 3 shows that I played with Steve were total imposter syndrome, and me just throwing my hands at the phrases and knowing that this is this milepost here, this mile marker here. If I get from there to there and kind of play the stuff in between, maybe no one will notice. And then it was 4 shows in. I remember actually when it locked in. I
Yeah.
wish it had locked in during rehearsal rather than on the gig. But you take what you can get.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in that particular video, you look very comfortable, very relaxed playing that piece of music. Excuse me.
And it is true. And some of it is just like it's not imposter syndrome, but it's like it's being self-effacing to maybe an unnecessary degree, because you have to develop the base amount of technique in order to play in unison with Steve Vai.
Yeah.
And it is empirically true that I was doing that. But at the same time, it's humbling because you can see that it comes so naturally to Steve. It's like breathing. And for me, it was, a constant struggle. But part of that struggle was coming off and on stage as though it weren't a struggle.
Yeah.
And that's why, you'll see people talking about that Attitude song and saying like, oh, you're so nonchalant up there. You're so confident. It's just like you're just tossing it off without thinking. And I'm just like, glad it looks that way. I was definitely mindful at every second that you could not slack off for a moment with that stuff. But I also felt that it was that audiences are much more comfortable and entertained when they're not seeing somebody visibly struggling. It's like the appearance of nonchalance is a form of showmanship in a way. So I realized that for the character that I was sort of portraying on stage, which was kind of the anti-guitar hero with these stupid hats and super cheap suits that I was wearing and stuff, as opposed to, there's a deliberate contrast to Steve Vai, the ultimate rock guitar hero. Although it's interesting to get to know Steve and realize that there's so much more to him than guitar heroism, and he's such a wonderful guy and a beautiful composer and just a multifaceted person. But the character that he inhabits on stage is the sort of untouchable supreme rock guitar hero. And I was there was no way I could compete on that front, and I understood that there was no earthly reason for me to try, so I went in the other direction and cut my hair shorter and started wearing ridiculous hats. I stopped playing with Steve in 2001, started playing with Satriani in 2010. During that time, I was real focused on solo music and trying to make a go of it in a musical career, just doing solo stuff, which proved to be untenable. And then I got the Death Clock gig in 2007. That was like the first sort of major touring gig after Vai. And then a few years after that is when Satriani got in touch, which turned into a 9-year run, which is a long time for Joe's band. He usually doesn't keep people in the band for that long. So that was highly enjoyable. The music is more basic by design. Satriani really wants his material to be very approachable for large numbers of listeners, whereas Steve is not afraid to leave listeners stranded by the roadside in pursuit of this more spiritual thing that he's after as a composer. Although obviously Steve also likes to entertain people, I think that Joe is really focused on connecting and entertaining with as many ears as he can reach. And his way of doing that is to basically write classic rock songs with the guitar fulfilling the role of the lead vocalist. That's really what's happening in Joe's music. So the reason why he hired me, and it was initially as just a keyboard player, was because he had seen me playing with Steve, and he had reached this conclusion that when I was playing keyboard, it wasn't like I switched off my guitar mind. When I'm playing keyboard, I'm still approaching it as a guitarist with an innate understanding of what a lead guitar player either needs or doesn't need from an accompanist. Because I think Joe had tried playing with a number of keyboard players who felt driven to be, using a lot of jazz harmonies and substitutions and things that were pretty much just like roadblocks for Joe's approach to guitar. Whereas Frank Zappa, for instance, loved to have Tommy Mars just like sprinkling clouds of dense harmony throughout an otherwise static harmonic backdrop. You know, it might be based on one chord, but by the time Tommy Mars gets through with a one chord vamp, it has turned into a 79 chord symphony.
Yeah.
And Frank winding his way through, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, Joe is not that interested in having to wind his way through. He if he sets a basic harmonic backing for a solo, he wants it to remain basic. That's a part of his message.
Yeah.
His message is not, look how clever I can be, look how many you know, how abstract we can get harmonically here. You know, his thing is like trying to weave these phrases that really reach people and touch them. You know, some people might not be able to assess it that way, and they only hear you know, just like super virtuosic guitar playing for its own sake, and they can't ascertain that there is a heart and intention behind this stuff. But there really is with Joe's music, and it takes a little time to get locked into his zone, you know, because I come from all this super complex music and avant-garde stuff, and I was growing up listening to Beefheart and Henry Cow and the Residents and Frank, and you know, and Satriani's compositional palette is you know, is intentionally very much more straight ahead, to the extent that if he goes Lydian for a second, it's so effective, because it's, you know, that's like a splash of paint on the canvas suddenly. So you know, all this stuff is very mindful on Joe's part, and so it for me to get on that frequency took a bit of time, but once I did, I got so much satisfaction and pleasure from seeing how the audience received it. If this stuff is executed accurately to Joe's intent, you can see the result on the faces of the audience, and that's very, very gratifying. It's cool. And I probably played to larger audiences with Joe than anybody else I played with. We opened for Metallica one time to like 100,000 people, and that's a crazy sensation to be standing in front of that many people playing, and it's wonderful, you know. And also Joe is just, you know, you were asking to you know, in contrast to Steve is so hyper focused on what he's, you know, trying to accomplish musically, that it's a somewhat more of an intense environment with him. Whereas with Joe wants to be comfortable on the road. He prefers not to do sound checks. He likes staying in really nice hotels. So it was a very, you know, a comparatively luxurious experience being in Joe's band for 9 years. And I obviously very much enjoyed that aspect of it also.
Fantastic. Could we talk a little bit about your music now? There's an album that you did way back when, the Wood and Smoke album. A couple of tracks on it in particular that really moved me. The first one is Hello, the opening track. And I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but it's Hawkseth. Is it the third track on the album? Those are real masterpieces.
Oh, thank you.
Pieces of music.
It's Wood and Smoke. It was more of a consciously focused approach on that record than is usual for me, because I knew that I wanted that to be a mostly acoustic record, and that I was limiting myself compositionally on that record to the basic template for that album was no more than 3 major compositional ideas per song, because on earlier albums and in most of my music since, I don't place any restrictions on myself in that regard. I'll go in like 18 different directions on one song, and I'm happy to do that. For whatever reason in my head, that's what that particular song requires for me to feel like it's complete. On Wood and Smoke, there was I disciplined myself to keep it to far fewer ideas per song, because I just felt like that's what I needed to do to achieve the texture and the emotional effect that I was after for that record, which was basically, could best be described as meditative, maybe. You know, I was going for something calmer, and it still has aspects of, you know, some of my more unusual choices, but I think in a much more placid surface. So that's, but in general, I think, and these days when I've been composing, it's always just you sit silently, you wait for a phrase to come to you, you document that phrase. At this point, composing and recording is pretty much a simultaneous act for me, because every time I'm writing something, I'm doing it in the computer and shaping it in real time, in some cases orchestrating it in real time. And a phrase comes to you, you learn it from your mind, you translate it to your fingers, you record it, you listen to it, and you sit silently and you think, okay, what does this phrase want to come after it? What is this little piece of music asking for? And then the other game I play with that is imagining that I'm listening to it on a record. You put the needle on the record and you hear a phrase, which is the phrase you've just completed.
Right.
Okay, what do you want to hear next? What would thrill you the most? What would excite you the most? What would put you on the edge of your seat, wondering what's coming next the most? Or if your intention is to be just relaxing and calming, then it's okay, what settles my soul the most? Like what combination of notes and rhythms seems to put me most in the calm state that I'm seeking. But in either instance, whether it's searching for more extreme options or searching for the most meditative option, in both cases, I'm just like trying to find resonance with the spirit of music and the universe to some extent. Sure. As highfalutin as that might sound, I think that's kind of what all composers are doing, is to find resonance with some universal force. And you can only trust your instincts as to when you get there. It doesn't mean you're right, but every composer has their own set of standards for when you've reached that state. And then every artist's following is made up with people who agree with you on that. So everything that I do at this point is just meant to serve my instincts as to what the universe wants from me, and then to hopefully entertain the people who've developed a similar set of standards. And that was an interesting one, because it was based on a feeling that I wanted to apologize to somebody, in particular Peter Hogseth, who had won a contest a couple of years previously, where I was supposed to write a song for them, and I was supposed to have delivered it like a couple of years before that album came out, and it was one of those things where you move through life accomplishing the things you're able to accomplish, but in the back of your mind is this awareness of maybe one thing or multiple things that you just haven't been able to get around to yet for whatever reasons, and you beat yourself up for that. And I this song for Peter Hogseth was one of those. And so finally I sat down, and I was feeling really guilt-ridden, and it initially it came as a set of lyrics, which is, and I but like the opening phrase, which is da 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 da. I don't remember what the words were that I had in my head, but it was like, Peter, I'm sorry it took me this long, or something like that, and so the music that you hear is meant to accompany a set of lyrics that I didn't think necessarily were going to be a part of the final piece. I think I thought it was going to be instrumental, but I needed these lyrics. It's like the final movement of Love Supreme, where Coltrane is playing this prayer on the saxophone, and he's freely interpreting it. So if you read the poem on the album jacket, he's not playing it exactly, but you can still see where he's thinking. That's kind of where I might have even been inspired by that when I was putting Hogseth together. And then as I was writing it, initially I was thinking of it as the initial contest was I was going to write a song and send it to you on a CD, and it would be yours alone. But as I was writing this thing, I'm thinking, damn it, this is good. It was like, so I got a hold of Peter and I said, listen, I'm finally writing you your song. If it's okay with you, I would love to put it on my album and share it with the wider world. But I want to honor you by naming it after you. Is that okay?" And he was like, "Yep." So that's how that happened.
Well, you did the right thing. It's a wonderful piece of music. So
Thank you.
absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
There was something else I wanted to talk to you about. Wing Beat Fantastic and your collaboration with the great Andy Partridge.
Yeah.
How was that? How was that sort of musical relationship?
Just great fun and humbling and nourishing in a lot of ways, because at the time that I became a huge XTC fan, it unfortunately for me coincided with right, it was right at the moment, like I the first time I that they really made an impact on me was when I saw the video for Senses Working Overtime, which I had heard a couple of their songs by that point and maybe didn't even identify it as them. Like I'd heard Generals and Majors on the radio, but didn't know who the band was. But when I saw on MTV Senses Working Overtime, I identified it as XTC. And that song had a huge impact on me. And it really surprised me in the early 80s to hear something that was so acoustically based, and something that was so intriguing in terms of the chord shapes. The harmony of it was not like other stuff I was hearing at the time, and the chordal shifts moving into the chorus and the indelible nature of the chorus, and I literally, in terms of like pop music, hadn't heard anything that moved me that much since the Beatles. And the Beatles were everything to me when I was growing up, and XTC had a similar impact on me. And then I started, it was 1982 or 1983, so that I couldn't just like Google them and see what's up with this band. I had to like find magazines with articles about them. I had to go to the store and just start buying import singles. But gradually, I was able to figure out, oh no, they've just retired from the road, and this guy Andy Partridge might be losing his mind and unable to come out of his shed. So at that point, I was sad. I was fascinated by the records, but also like feeling this remorse over the course of Andy's journey. So by the time the Great Fire single came out and the Mummer album, those albums meant so much to me, because they were validation that not only was Andy not in a place of helplessness, because I was expecting to play these records and hear something like Syd Barrett's solo records where Dave Gilmour is just like trying to keep him propped up long enough to record something, but then you hear these songs on the Mummer album and Great Fire itself. I love those songs. I think Mummer is severely underrated. And so that was, and in fact, when I heard Mummer, I thought, not only is he just like, is he keeping up? He's like advancing. There's stuff on this album like Lady Bird, really heading into places harmonically that none of the previous records went.
Yeah.
So I was just like, that was hallelujah for me. So I became utterly obsessed with Andy and XTC at that point. So that when I managed to get into Zappa's band and we were on the road in England, and Scott Tunis, in his wisdom, at the time I thought was just a hopeless act, called Virgin Records to invite XTC to see us to all of our UK shows. And I just thought, they're just going to think this is like a practical joke. But here's Andy Partridge and Dave Gregory at the Birmingham Zappa show.
Fantastic.
Which I think was maybe the first concert that Andy had gone to, post leaving the concert stage himself. So for him to come to that show was no small matter. And to me, they were absolute heroes. And then to talk to them and find that they were extremely approachable, very incredibly good-humored, friendly, warm people, was the best gift I could have been given, possibly only exceeded by their invitation at the end of the night to visit them in the recording studio when they were going to be in Los Angeles a few months later to start working on Oranges and Lemons. Right. And at that point, I spent every spare moment I could in the recording studio just watching them make that record. But that was 88. and I we didn't start trying to write songs together until 2006. I think, yeah, that was, and neither Andy nor I can remember which one of us formally proposed that we collaborate. We were sending each other letters. Andy was interested in my development musically, so every time I would put out a CD, I would send him one. I would send to Dave as well, and they were both always very, very supportive. And as I say, I can't remember whether it was Andy or I who said, let's just try writing together, you know. But it must have stricken both of us at the same time as, you know, clearly the right thing to do. And you know, this at this point, this was, you know, the mid 2000s. Collaboration via the internet was at that point, it wasn't where either of our minds went for whatever reason. Instead, it was determined that I would have to go to England and stay there, you know, stay in Swindon at a bed and breakfast. And I did that twice, for 1 week in 2006 and then another week in 2008.
Right.
And it was literally just a completely collaborative process of moment by moment. It might be, you know, like the beginning of I'm going to say it was the song Wing Be Fantastic itself. That one started by Andy saying, play me a chord. And then I just chose the chord to play. And then he would say, okay, now play one a bit higher. And then I chose another song, and he would say, change that one note. And then he would basically edit my real-time composer decisions. So it was a second to second, chord to chord collaboration.
Interesting.
Until you've got an entire song structure. And then it's, okay, what does this song make you feel like? You know, what possible lyrical subjects does this music evoke? Which is something that Andy is more attuned to than any other composer I know of. And also the way that he will take one subject matter and plumb that subject matter to within an inch of its life. He'll say, okay, this song's about ants, and then, you know, and then you'll just go every possible metaphor or descriptive term for the way ants go about their lives. And that is amazing and you know, inspiring and humbling, the way he does lyrics. So whereas I felt entirely like I didn't feel like I was misplaced at all or in the wrong part of the world when we were working on music together, but whenever we were working on lyrics together, that was like pulling everything out of me to try to stay on anywhere close to his level and contribute, you know, anything that was valuable. But we did, you know, manage. I would say that, you know, the majority of the lyrical content, like I'm Raining Inside, is, except for one word, is all Andy lyrically. You Kill Me is entirely Andy. But then, you know, everything else is a variety of collaborations. And then there are other songs on that album that are just songs that I wrote on my own that I thought complemented what I had done with Andy and just belonged on the same album together. So, you know, there's a couple little instrumental segues that are just me. And then the last song on the album, there was a misprint on the back of the CD cover. It's the song Land is listed as Keneally Partridge, but that's actually just is one that I wrote. As actually, it was originally composed as part of this long-term narrative thing that I've been working on called Scambot, and Land was a part of the Scambot concept, but I sacrificed it for Scambot to end Wingbeat, because I thought that it somehow summed up that album for me.
Yeah. So that must have been a great opportunity, and
it was so crazy. I mean, it's like at that point, because we'd met in 1988, we didn't start writing together until 2006. So, you know, I felt that we had developed a friendship at that point, but not any kind of a working relationship. But the songwriting just grew naturally out of the friendship, and there was no pressure to it at all. We didn't have any specific end game in mind. It's just like, let's write songs and see what happens. So I wasn't thinking about the album as an album. And in fact, after we had done these 2-week-long writing sessions, in the back of my mind, I had thought, I will probably do another session. I'd like to get back together with them and write some more. And then somebody emailed me probably in 2010 2010, early 2010, and said, "Hey, did you see this interview with Andy? He's like wondering what's taking you so long." And I'm like, "What?" And I read the interview, and somebody said, "So what's the status of your collaboration with Mike Keneally?" And he said, "I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, I'm done. I'm just waiting for him to make the album." And I'm like, "Really?" And I wrote to him and said, "Should have had this conversation." I thought we were still, in process. And he said, "No, I feel like, there's enough material there for you to make something of it." So at that point, I was like, "Okay, what is it?" Because at that point, I didn't know if he was going to be a part of the recording or not, but that wasn't his wish. So what I did was, okay, well, I'm just going to make an album in my normal structure, which is in California with this engineer, Mike Harris, primarily working in the home of my manager at the time, Scott Chatfield, who co-owns the record label XOX with me. So I'll be in my regular structure, but instead of just doing my own music, I'll work on these songs with Andy. And I was keeping him in the loop by sending him rough mixes of stuff as I was doing it, and he would send back lengthy screeds, dissecting my there's basically, like, I wouldn't call them demos because they were just like the very earliest working versions of what became the final tracks later. But he gave me so much valuable input along the way that he was basically just transatlantic co-producer on this stuff.
Yeah. What kind of input did he have in terms of, was it in terms of arrangement, instrumentation? What kind of things?
Pretty much everything, every aspect of a track. He was definitely focused on vocal delivery, so he was riding me hard to make sure that I was singing the stuff as well as I possibly could. And I probably went through, I think I sent him 5 different lead vocal takes of the song "Your House" before he said, "Okay, there you go, you got it." That was very educational for me vocally, because I always came to my own music instrumentally first, with the vocals almost as an afterthought. And at a certain point I realized, okay, I'm doing the music a disservice, I'm doing the audience a disservice, I'm doing myself a disservice, because I saw some stuff online where people were saying, "Oh yeah, Keneally, he's a great guitar player, but man, I wish he'd keep his mouth shut." So I said, "Well, that's not good. You don't want to. You really don't want to, have that be your rep." Like, I mean, my voice is the voice that I have. As much as I might want to sound like Jeff Buckley or Tom York, I don't. So I have to work with the machinery I've been given, but I have to work with it as best I can, and especially in live performance, not downplay it, because I always felt like in the 90s when I was first starting as really focusing on solo performance. Well, the 90s were in almost an anti-entertainment time anyway. There was a lot of kind of like intentionally willfully subverting of showbiz norms at that time, and a part of that for me was being almost offhand with vocal delivery. So I would be shredding on stage and doing all this insane stuff on the guitar and singing at the same time, and I kind of thought, that's enough. If I'm able to execute anything vocally while doing this simultaneously, that should be enough for people, right? But what I didn't take into account is that most people, when they listen to you, they're not clocking the virtuosic moves required to execute a thing. It's just sound. It's just a thing they're hearing. And that's what I really took me a long time to realize, is that music is not a series of techniques, or it's not even about talent. It's about sound. And how does that sound affect people? How does it reach people? So and people are really focused whenever anybody opens their mouth to sing. That's where the focus goes. And I was really kind of underplaying that. And so the process of having Andy get on me about that and make sure if you're going to sing this, sing it. And really listening back to it, trying to remove myself from myself, like that's not me singing, it's just something I'm listening to, and what do I want to hear, what serves the song. And then that starting to get more serious about that in the studio led to me becoming much more serious about that on stage. And that's paid dividends, because in the last number of years I've had more people come up to me after a show and say, I've never heard you sing like that before. So it's like, that's good to know that it's paying off. But I can really, I don't know that I've ever done it consciously, but I can really thank Andy for kind of, getting me set in on that direction of just taking it more seriously. Ultimately, the satisfying moment of that record for me was when Andy liked it, because the whole time I was creating it, outside of his direct view, all I was thinking was, is he gonna like this? Is he gonna like this? And ultimately he just was very fond of the record, and I was very grateful for that. So that was mission accomplished.
I did a couple of videos with Andy a while back, and I was just floored, really, because I hadn't really taken into consideration how great a guitar player he actually is.
Oh yeah.
I had taken it for granted, because listening to all the records, I just assume, oh, that's Dave, that's Dave, that's Dave. And just some of the stuff he played. And I spoke to Dave recently, and he was telling me that no, he said, but I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's not me playing that solo. That's Andy. It's the octave solo on Down in the Cockpit. And I was like, oh, that's Andy. That's fantastic.
Oh yeah, anytime you get that a specific kind of rhythmic thing that I've almost never heard anybody do the way he does. Yeah, he's like outrageous with the right hand.
Yeah, that right hand just fiery.
Yeah.
But and also very self-deprecating, which is bizarre, because it's such greatness, and it was also revelatory. I did not know that. I didn't know that they attended a Zappa concert, and I didn't know that you were there for some of the sessions on Oranges and Lemons. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm eternally grateful to Scott Tunis for thinking that there was a chance even that he could coerce Andy Partridge into coming out of his shed and come to that concert. I thought there was no hope, and so that was amazing to me. And
absolutely,
and yeah, thank you, Scott, because that led to a whole bunch of really wonderful stuff in my life.
It's interesting how these things work, isn't it? These little events.
And we're discussing doing more. It's a long time since that record came out, and we're both curious to see what might come of attempting further collaboration. So I owe him a call, actually.
Yeah, well, we'll look forward to that. That'd be great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it as well, and total pleasure.
Thank you very much. I wish you the best, Mike.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.